Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruchi Amin. I'm a pediatric surgeon here in South Florida, so I do have the privilege and the pleasure of working with Ben and Daphne and Rooney and the amazing team down here. So I'm thrilled to have the privilege of speaking with you today. They said, tell me something innovative in pediatric surgery. Tell us something exciting. And so I thought to myself, well, if I look back at a decade of training and now being in practice, what is the most innovative thing that I can tell you about today? And for me, that's really been the evolution of tissue engineering as a way to help some of our most vulnerable pediatric patients. So this story begins with this picture. So one of my favorite childhood memories was really going to work with my dad on Saturdays and spending time in his office. So by trade, he was an electrical and a computer engineer. And as long as I can remember, he was always taking machines apart and putting them together, tinkering, building supercomputers. And so I used to love playing with all the gadgets and the gizmos in his office. And I think I was about 4 or 5 years old when I was rifling through his desk and I found this heavy plaque. And I said, Dad, what is this? And he said, well, this is a US patent for a little microprocessor chip that he had invented. And it had the word inventor on there. And I said, Dad, what's an inventor? And he said, an inventor is someone who's done something that no one has ever done before. And at the age of 4 or 5, I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And I said, Dad, I want to be an inventor. I want to do something that no one has done before. Now, I think my dad had other plans for me. I think he'd always hoped that I'd be an engineer, either me or my brother. Unfortunately, we both actually went off to medical school and became doctors. So I think he was also the first Indian parent that was actually disappointed that their children became doctors. Now, while I didn't become an engineer like my dad had hoped, I did go off to do my undergraduate training at the Stevens Institute of Technology, where I spent some time in the biomedical engineering department, and that's where I met Dr. Yu. Now, Dr. Yu was the first person who introduced me to the field of tissue engineering. And so his work, based on using polymers and different bioactive materials to create scaffolds that could then be implanted into human patients for targeted drug delivery. Long story short, basic science life was not it for me, and I learned very quickly that I wasn't meant to be a basic scientist. However, it was the first time that I realized that we can use this technology to really help save lives. So I went off to medical school, then I went off to general surgery residency, fell in love with pediatric surgery, and like most of us that go down that road, did end up taking some time off to do some additional training. And that brought me to snowy Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I spent a year doing a critical care fellowship in pediatric surgery and doing a year of clinical research there. And that is where I met Thomas Richards. So coincidentally, a few weeks after I would start my critical care fellowship, Thomas underwent a major life-saving surgery using 3D printed technology, and he would also become the oldest living survivor of tracheal agenesis here in the United States. So tracheal agenesis is a very rare condition. There's really been only over maybe 100 or so cases ever reported because most of these children generally die shortly after delivery. There have been 6 survivors worldwide, 4 of which are considered long-term, all of which were in Japan. The single postnatal US survivor only survived for 6 weeks, and this was back in 1963. So Thomas was born as a full-term infant up at a level 3 NICU in Marshfield, Wisconsin. He had a normal delivery, and mom's prenatal history was significant only for some polyhydramnios. Now, shortly after delivery, he developed some respiratory failure, and the team had a difficult time establishing an airway. Ultimately, they were able to do an esophageal intubation, and when they attempted an emergent tracheostomy at the bedside, they couldn't find the trachea. So they got on the phone with the team down in Milwaukee, and together they pieced together that the child likely had a tracheal agenesis with a distal tracheoesophageal fistula. So at that time, they decided that we were going to put a clip across the esophagus, put in a G-tube to temporarily decompress the stomach, and patch the abdomen closed and transfer him to Milwaukee so he could get definitive care. Once he arrived to Milwaukee, he underwent a full Vactral workup, had a CTA of the chest that confirmed the anatomy, and he ultimately started to have an evolving leak through that esophageal clip. So on day of life 4, he was taken back to the operating room and underwent a formal esophageal division. Now, after this procedure, the concern was that we weren't sure what his neurologic outcome was going to be. He had a pretty prolonged, significant episode of hypoxia lasting 20, 30 minutes, and there was some concerns as to whether that would have any long-term neurodevelopmental issues. So after a few days of monitoring, multiple studies, and some reassuring findings, we finally had a frank discussion with the family about how critically ill he was, and ultimately they decided that they wanted to proceed. So on day of life 18, we did a proximal esophageal division, brought out a spit fistula so that he could maintain oral feedings, and also did a pseudotracheostomy where we placed an endotracheal tube through that proximal esophagus that would then ventilate through that fistula that you can see at the level of the carina. Now, he did surprisingly well after that procedure. He was able to stay on the mechanical ventilator. We were able to get him to full enteral feeds through his G-tube, and he was growing. Now, the next stage of the plan, we thought, let's get him to 6 months of age. At that point, we'll do an external esophageal stent and basically recreate a trachea out of his esophagus. We used 3D printing technology and to help us figure out that a 20 millimeter ringed PTFE graft for a length of 5 centimeters would be adequate to provide ventilation. Now, unfortunately, on day of life 75, so a few months short of that 6-month mark, we began having issues. He was having longer inflation times. There was air trapping on the chest x-ray. His PCO2 was climbing into the 80s and the 100s. Now, as fate would have it, around this time, the Pacific Association of Pediatric Surgery meeting was also taking place in Hawaii. So a few of the surgeons from Milwaukee happened to be in Hawaii, and they actually were able to meet with several of the surgeons from Japan at Osaka University. And prior to this, the surgeons in Japan actually had the most experience with tracheal agenesis, as they've had really the majority of the long-term survivors. So what they explained to the team in Milwaukee is that this was expected because the fistula, which really was only 1 millimeter in diameter, remains relatively fixed in size. So the fistula doesn't grow, but the baby does. And so what happens is at some point, as the somatic growth of the baby doesn't catch up with the fistula, you start to have a mismatch. So the surgeons in Japan had found that if you don't intervene immediately, this is how the patients end up having respiratory failure and a lot of them not surviving. So they urged the team in Milwaukee to move up their timeline and to move forward with a formal esophagocarinoplasty. So on day of life 90, the patient was taken to the operating room, had a sternotomy done on cardiopulmonary bypass, and we put the ringed PTFE graft to recreate our esophagus. The anastomosis was done at the level of the carina, including both the fistula as well as the right and left mainstem. We circumferentially put sutures to help open up that esophagus, and the distal anastomosis was then created. Now, the important thing to remember is the esophagus is a muscular floppy tube, right? It doesn't have the structure or the support that a real trachea would have. So what we did was we actually did an intraoperative endoscopy so that we could see the luminal diameter, and then we put additional sutures to help open up any areas of mucosal redundancy to make sure that we had a nice, open, and structured airway. And once the patient was brought over to the neotrachea, we noticed that the PEEP and the ventilatory requirements precipitously dropped. Now, post-operatively, he was weaned for mechanical ventilation over the next few weeks. He was maintained on the vent at night for rest. We were able to feed him through the spit fistula, so he was maintaining oral skills. And as you can see, we've got CT reconstruction. So the image on the left with the arrow was the initial 1 millimeter fistula that he was ventilating through prior to the reconstruction. And the image on the right shows the newly constructed esophagus. A bronchoscopy was then done at 1 year of age, and this shows that the anastomosis was widely patent with no granulation tissue and no evidence of stricturing or narrowing at the level of the anastomosis. So these are pictures of Thomas as he was leaving the hospital on a day 156 post-op. So that's a picture of Dr. Dominguez, who is the original surgeon in Marshfield, Wisconsin, his entire surgical team in Milwaukee that included Dr. Densmore, his primary pediatric surgeon, Dr. Oldham, Dr. Mitchell, our cardiac surgeon, our ENT surgeons. And the picture on the right in the Spider-Man shirt, that's Thomas Richards celebrating his 8th birthday this year. So he's playing hockey, he's on the baseball team, he's eating by mouth, he's able to communicate by writing on an iPad and by sign language. So it's really, truly a beautiful story of success. Now, I think the thing that makes it even more wonderful is, everybody wants to do something for the first time, right? But the true measure of success is if you can create a process or create a system so that it can be replicated. And just a few short months after Thomas was born, another child with tracheal agenesis was delivered at Penn State Children's Hospital. And using a similar 3D printing technology and with an implanted scaffold, that child also was discharged after 13 months in the hospital with a successful esophageal reconstruction. The utilities of 3D printing are vast and could be a whole nother lecture in and of itself, but I did want to take a little bit of time to also give you a snapshot into other options that we have for tissue replacement. So now, having transitioned into practice itself, my area of interest is really in finding new ways to create tissue replacement. So as I moved into fellowship, I began having a lot more experience with a material called ACell. And so this is a porcine extracellular bladder matrix, so it's basically pig bladder. But what it does is it promotes rapid revascularization, it improves the tissue integrity and flexibility that you use it for, and what makes it incredibly unique is that it actually remodels into the native tissue. So that's different than some of the non-biologic grafts that we use or the biologic grafts that we know will eventually result in recurrence requiring multiple surgeries. So this was a patient that was treated at our facility several years before I was there, but that I was able to see in follow-up. And so initially, this child was born with a giant omphalocele, and as you can see, the liver is out in that defect. Now, this child also concurrently had a congenital diaphragmatic hernia with diaphragmatic agenesis on the right. So neither of these defects was amenable to a primary repair. So this patient actually had an ACell graft placed as part of their abdominal wall and as a bridging measure for their diaphragmatic hernia repair, and was able to undergo closure of both of those on day of life 2. Now here on the right, you can see what that abdomen looks like. The child is now 6 years old, and she has no hernia. She's got a little bit of a scar, but she's got intact fascia, intact muscle, and has not required any revisional surgery for any kind of abdominal wall defect. And even more exciting than that, take a look at that chest x-ray. That chest x-ray is just from 2 years ago, and that right diaphragm looks exactly like the left diaphragm. It's got the same contour, there's no flattening, and we actually had the patient undergo dynamic studies under fluoro where we watched her breathe, and the diaphragmatic excursion on the right was exactly the same on the left. So there's no way to tell that she's had any kind of biologic tissue placed into that diaphragm. So I think that a lot of these applications, we're still learning how they work. They're new and they're exciting, but they do offer a lot of innovative solutions for children that had congenital anomalies that previously were very morbid or even lethal. And thank you.